2. If this quest, the Jade Key, had developed as it happened in the beta, the following should have occurred. Whether we allied with the Forest Elf or the Dark Elf, ultimately both would end up dead. The elf we sided with would remain alive for a few seconds extra, long enough to say, "Deliver this key to such and such," before perishing. The such and such being either the Forest Elf base on the north end of the woods or the Dark Elf base on the south. Once the bodies had vanished, a small bag of soon leaves would be left behind, containing a large and beautiful key carved of green stone. At that point, of course, the player was able to take the key to the northern or southern camp. They would sell it to an NPC shop if they wished, but that would permanently prevent them from finishing the quest. If properly delivered without failing into a temptation, the commander at the elf base would part with a special reward and the initiation of the next quest. But I had no idea there was a different branching pathway in the quest, one in which the elf ally survived the battle. If I didn't know it, no one else did, even Argo. We had to expect a totally new, unfamiliar story ahead. A short distance away from me, Asuna and the still silent dark elf Kismel, the forest elf's body disappeared with a brief crackle. We received a considerable amount of experience, along with a couple of rare items, but I didn't have time to check that now. A familiar bag of leaves was lying on the ground where the forest elf's body had been. Abandoned items had been claimed soon, before they disappeared into thin air, but I wasn't even sure if I was supposed to pick this one up. What if I touched it, and it was a trigger that turned Kismel hostile? Gee, what's this? I said unconvincingly. Asuna bent down and picked up the key as though nothing was out of the ordinary, though I hastily grabbed the hood of her cape, which earned me a furious glare. Finally, Kismel reacted. She bent over and cradled the bag carefully with her black leather gloves. An exhalation of relief left her lips, so she held it close to her chest. "At least we can protect the sanctuary now," she murmured to herself, put the bag in her waist pouch, and stood up to face us. The subtle way her ferocity in her eyes, despite her wavering hesitation, didn't seem possible for a mere simple system-controlled object. "I must thank you," she said, her armor clanking as she bowed in salute. "The first secret key has been protected. Your assistance is appreciated. Come with me to our base, and the commander will wish you a reward for your help." Again, a question mark appeared over her head to indicate quest in progress. I was inwardly relieved, though I did my best not to show it. It seemed that the quest would proceed as normal, even after we beat the elf ourselves. However, my original plan was butt into the fight, let them both perish, get the key, and return to the main town. We hadn't taken a break to refresh the resupply since beating the second floor boss. The elation at reaching the new floor was masking my fatigue, but exhaustion here was mental rather than physical, and hit the player like a ton of bricks out of nowhere. My current partner, Asuna, had passed out from extreme exhaustion right after our first meeting down in the first floor labyrinth. While it was rare to get that far, lapses of concentration led to mistakes, and controlling that fatigue safely was a vital tool for any solo player. I peered sidelong at the fencer. She took a step forward without a glance at me and spoke to Kismel herself. "In that case, we'd be honored." I wasn't the only one who held my tongue. Kismel stared at Asuna in silence. NPCs in Einkrad, technically, the Dark Elf Kismel was classified as a mob, did not respond to a player comments unless they came in a clear yes or no form. I coughed awkwardly, ready to give a simpler answer, but before I could get the words out of my mouth, the knight nodded and spun around. "Very well. The base camp is through the south end of the woods." My quest log updated. The question mark over her head vanished. At the same time, a message appeared in the upper left indicating that the third party member had joined. A fresh new HP bar was added to the list. Kismel strode off coolly, and Asuna sprang after her. I stood, rooted to the spot, for 3 seconds, hurrying off to catch up. The elf must have picked up an affirmative nuance from Asuna's reply, but as far as I know, NPCs in the beta test had nowhere near the kind of conversational ability. Perhaps it was simpler as an NPC's response database being expanded between the end of the beta and the start of the retail game. But something about Kismel's speech and expression felt too natural for that to be the explanation. She was just like any other player. I walked at the rear of the 3-man team, examining her color cursor just to be sure. It was yellow for NPC, technically an event mob, and her name was listed as Kismel, Dark Elven Royal Guard. Players weren't allowed to replicate monster titles within their names, so this was proof that Kismel was indeed nothing more than a moving object controlled by the system. If SAO was a normally functioning game, there might be a faint chance that she was actually being played by a member of the game staff, but that couldn't be true now because now it's deadly. It must be my imagination. I sped up to draw even with the 2 women. Being an overpowered beater might have created a dangerously unpredictable set of circumstances in this case, but there was one way in which it was definite improvement. Reaching the Dark Elf base required venturing off the path and through the woods, increasing the chances of enemy encounters, and given the thick, obscuring mists that gave the forest its name, it was all too easy to lose sight of one's location. But Kismel served us valuably in more ways than one. Her saber made quick work of any foes who's happened to cross our path. And as for an elf, she seemed to know exactly which way to go through the heavy mists. As an admirer of efficiency, I considered taking this opportunity to wander around and fight more mobs with Kismel, but I thought better of it. I didn't want to give the proud elite elf warrior a reason to be angry with me. So it took 15 minutes of hiking through misty forests to reach the sight of many black flags ripping in the breeze. That didn't take very long, Asuna said next to me, and I had reluctantly agreed. Kismel stopped marching, turned around to face us. She spoke with what I thought was a note of pride in her voice. A forest sinkling charm has been cast on the camp. You would have not found it easily without me. Oh, a charm? Is that like magic? I thought there wasn't any magic in this world. Asuna boldly remarked. I felt a chill run down my back. Aside from her overly informal tone, I wasn't sure if Asuna said was even understandable to the NPC, and her preset array of responses. It felt like Kismel might not be able to answer it, even if she understood the meaning. The reason magic didn't exist in SAO was to allow players the experience of melee combat firsthand in VR MMO environment. They didn't want to turn it into a long-distance shooter. Listen, Asuna, that's not... I started, trying to help Kismel out by explaining the concept, but once again my consideration was totally unnecessary. Our charms are not up to the level of magic, the dark elf said, her long eyelashes low. If anything, they're just a faint afterglow of great magic of old. When we were cut from the tree of the earth, the people of Lysula lost all magic. The shock of what she said hit me 5 seconds later. That was as long as it took to actually process what she'd said. We lost all magic because we were cut free from the earth. I had a feeling that she wasn't just giving an explanation of why magic skills didn't exist in Sword Art Online. This might be something that corresponded directly to the existence of the floating castle, Einkrad. Now that I thought of it, I never had any exposure to the background story of SAO. I tore through countless articles and interviews about the game that was first announced, but nothing more was said about this setting other than it was a floating castle in the sky, made up of hundreds of floors, with their own little world maps. This was strange, because whether single player or multiplayer, the background story of an RPG of how the world came to be was usually just as important as the concrete game itself. Even in the beta test, the background of the world was opaque. I completed this campaign quest back then, but I recalled that the story being rather simple, unconnected to the origins of Einkrad. The forest elves and the dark elves were fighting over some holy sanctuary, whatever that actually was. When the retail game launched and promptly trapped all of its guests inside, I felt like I understood why the background of SAO was such a blank slate. The lack of a story of any kind of a descriptive background was a challenge from the developer himself. Kayaba was telling us, the stage is set, it's up to you to create the story now. That was just my imagination talking, of course, but it didn't seem very far-fetched at this point. In that case, the words of Kismel the Dark Elf as an extension of the SAO system surpassed even Kayaba's intentions. I was possessed by an urge to overwhelm the Elven Knight with questions as we walked, whether this Lysula was a continent, or a kingdom, or a city, why the Dark Elves were torn from their home, why they were trapped here in the floating castle, what this castle really was, and why it had been built. Most likely, none of that information had any bearing on our primary goal, beating the game, returning to reality. The only reason I had started this campaign quest was for the plentiful experience points and the high-level rewards. There was no emotional attachment to the Dark Elf forces. If Asuna had insisted, I would have sided with the Forest Elf man against Kismil earlier. I stifled my sudden burst of curiosity with a deep breath and continued my silent march behind the knight. As we approached the swirling black flags, the mist suddenly cleared away as though they had never been there, and my field of vision returned. We were very close to the southern end of the forest. Sharp-cut rock walls extended left to right. A narrow passage, barely 15 feet wide, proceeded through the rock. Slim pillars of either side. Atop the poles flew landmark black flags adorned with crests of horns and blades. Standing before the two poles were dark elf soldiers, proudly bearing glaives and wearing heavier armor than Kismel, though still light compared to the variety available to players. Our companions strode up to the guards. When I did this quest in the beta, Kismel had perished against the forest elf, and our party of 4 had approached these guards without a go-between. But it was this situation that had me more nervous. Asuna leaned over and whispered, "I might as well ask, we're not going to have to fight in this base camp, are we?" "We won't. We shouldn't, as long as we don't attack any of them at least. Or maybe they just cancel out your progress and kick you out?" "You'd better not attempt to find out," she glared at me, then summoned her courage and picked up the pace. Fortunately, the guards did nothing worse than glare suspiciously as we passed them. After a short walk through the narrow passage, it opened wide onto space a good 50 yards across. About 20 tents of black and purple, various sizes, filled the space as a glamorous dark elf strode about the grounds. All in all, an impressive sight. "Wow, the camp's a lot bigger than it was in the beta," I murmured, quiet enough so Kismil couldn't hear. Asuna looked at me doubtfully. "Was it in a different place before?" "Yeah, but not the strange thing. Most of these locations are related to the campaign, are temporary instances." "Insentance?" Asuna had brushed up furiously on her gaming lingo in the last month, but this term was unfamiliar. I explained as we walked towards the largest tent in the back of the canyon. It's a location that's created temporarily for each party taking on the quest. I guess you could say, see, we're going to talk to the Dark Elf leader to advance the quest, but if another party comes along, that makes it complicated, doesn't it? Some quests, like the Herbs of the Forest quest on the first floor, and they shut off the area for general access if someone's talking to the NPC. So you're saying that I have temporarily vanished from the third floor map to move to this base? That's right, I said, impressed by the speed of her understanding. She narrowed her eyes and gave me a sneering look. You can leave any time, right? Then, proceedings had been rather irregular. But the meeting with the commander of the Dark Elf Advance Forces went smoothly. Of course, being presumably stronger than Kismel, the commander could have slaughtered us in seconds if anything went wrong. He was delighted the safe return of Kismel and the Jade Key, granting us considerable rewards and equipment, even better than the choices we had several items. The saber decorated like Kismel's swords drew my eye, but my Neelblade +6 was stronger, so I had settled on a ring that added a point to strength. Asuna made a similar decision, choosing an earring with +1 to agility. The commander finished by initiating a new quest for the second leg of the campaign. Asuna and I left the tent. Back into the grassy canyon, the ceiling formed by the first floor above acted as our sky was turning from the color of a sunset. It had to be close to 5 o'clock. Now that my nerves had eased, fatigue was thudding down. It was time to rest for the day. Kismel stretched in a realistically natural way and turned to us, a hint of a smile on her lips. Warriors of humankind, allow me to thank you again for your help. I hope that you will assist in our next operation. We'd be happy to help. Now that I think of it, I have not heard your names yet. What are they? My eyes nearly bugged out of their sockets again. I'd never been asked my name by a mob before. No, I couldn't keep treating her like a monster. She was an NPC. My name is Kirito. Your human names are difficult to pronounce. Is it Kirito? Her intonation was slightly off, so I repeated myself. Kirito. Kirito. That's perfect. That must have been a system sequence to fine-tune the name pronunciation. Somewhat relieved that she was finally doing something recognizable, NPC-like, I watched Kismel repeat the process with Asuna. Once she was satisfied, she'd learned the way of our names were said. The Lady Knight continued. Kirito and Asuna, please call me Kismel. I will leave the timing of our departure up to you. If you wish to return to your human town, I can send you nearby with another charm, or you can spend the night in one of our tents. Finally, something going exactly as I remember, I thought. Back to the beta test, I took a fair number of naps in the tents to save time on travel back to town. The beds were nice, the food was good, and most importantly, both were free. It was only lasted while the quest was active, but it would be a waste not to take advantage of that value. Asuna had read my mind like a book. With an exasperated shrug of her shoulders, she answered, In that case, we will be grateful to accept your hospitality. Perhaps you should save your thanks. After all, that's right. This is it. Wait, that's not right. At this point, we'd been granted the use of an empty tent, as its owner had died at the start of the quest. In other words, it was originally Kismel's sleeping chamber that me and my 3 party members, all men, had borrowed. But now the lady was alive, which meant, without a spare tent, you will need to share mine. It will be a tight fit for all 3 of us, but you're welcome. No, we'd be happy to. 3 of us? Asuna stopped still. Kismel seemed to be waiting for more of a definitive statement, so I picked up the slack. Thank you. We'll be happy to use it. Good. I will be here within the grounds, so call upon me if you should need anything. So long for now. The proud dark elf bowed again, strode off toward the dining tent. Asuna was frozen in place for 3 whole seconds, then turned toward me, her face shifting through 3 different expressions. Is it possible to back out and have her charm over us towards the town? Sadly, I knew the answer already. One of our party members in the beta had tried that very thing. As a beater, it was my duty to pass on the information in my pocket. No. As with the base camp itself, Kismel Tent had been upgraded significantly since the beta. The owner had described it as a tight fit for 3, but in reality, 6 of us could have set up with beds with room to spare. Thick, luxurious pelts were spread across the ground, easily comfortable enough to sleep until the morning. The tent fabric that served as walls was thick and woven as well, enough to block out as all sound from the outside. In the front of the center pillar was an oddly shaped heater that emitted an orange glow with a pleasant warmth. I walked into the center of the pleasant, comfortable space and sat down, sighing in contentment. Lazily, I lifted a hand to open my window and slowly removed my sword and various articles of armor. When I rolled onto my back, I accidentally met the cold glare of Asuna. The fencer took a few steps over me and gently nudged my side with the tip of her boot. I submitted to her silent pressure, rolling over until I hit the left wall of the tent, at which point Asuna removed her boot. That's your spot. Imagine there's a border right here. She traced an imaginary line with her boot, about a third of the way into the tent. And I had to find out, and what happens if I attempt to invade your border? This camp isn't considered a safe zone, is it? I read you loud and clear, I said, nodding on the ground. She smiled back, walked to the other side of the room. The round tent was about 25 feet across, so there was quite a distance from wall to wall. I watched her cross, then removed her breastplate and rapier, shaking out her long hair before she sat atop the furs. She leaned her back against a pillar and muffled something over a moment before putting on her long boots and storage as well. Asuna stretched out her long, white-socked feet, looked up at the ceiling, and let out a slow, steady sigh. When she eventually looked over to me, I was rudely staring back. I glanced away, hastily, and babbled in a high voice. So, I don't mind sleeping outside if you prefer. I've got a sleeping bag and everything. It's fine as long as you respect the border, she responded, her voice surprisingly neutral. I hazarded another glance across the tent. Asuna was rubbing the furs on the ground with her hand as she changed the topic to something that had caught her interest. So, about this quest series, I'm not quite sure of the point of it yet. It's not something about how either of the Dark Elves or the Forest Elves are good or evil, right? Yeah, that's right. Assuming the gist is the same as in the beta, they're a floor above us, with a place called the Sanctuary, with some incredibly powerful items sealed inside of it. And the Dark Elves and the Forest Elves are fighting over it. So that key in the bag of leaves was to the Sanctuary? Yep, if I remember correctly, there are 6 of them in total, hidden across the floors, so collecting them is the main focus of the quest. I see. That's what I was wondering about. So, you said that when we first spotted Kismel, the forest elf, we could choose which side to help, right? I did. Which means some players could choose to side with the forest elves and be working with the other side of the story at the same time as us, right? That's right, I said, and finally realized what Asuna was getting at. Oh, you're wondering if we ever have to come across players working on the forest elf side while doing a quest. Maybe we'll end up competing or fighting with them, she finished, her eyebrows knitted in concern. I put on an awkward smile to reassure her. Don't worry, it won't come to that. It's not like one of those quests to kill certain number of enemies or collect a certain amount of loot where you have to compete with other players to reach your allotted total. These story style quests make it so each player or party has their own independent, um, what you call it. I tried to frame it in a way that a beginner to MMOs would understand, but Asuna had already pieced it together. Oh, like this base camp. So a number of different parties can be at different points in the story and reach completely different endings? Yeah, that's the gist of it. So we don't have to worry about groups following the enemy camp quest, trying to take these items from us. It's not as if one side completing the quest successfully means the opposing side loses. Ah. Asuna nodded in her apparent understanding, but her expression did not clear the way that suggested her fears had been eliminated. She weaved herself back up to a sitting position and crossed her legs, facing me directly. Something still bothering you? I'm not sure if it's bothering me, I just hard to grasp. If you're right, this base camp instance, if a different one exists for every party doing the quests, then that means the same number of Kismels and commanders exist, too. That seems kind of. Yeah. I finally understood the nature of Asuna's confusion. It was the greatest contradiction of questing in an online game. Normally, an incident should arise once. For instance, Herbs of the Forest quest from the first floor. The sickly girl, Agatha, required special healing herbs that would only be collected from a plant type monster. I handily, okay, it wasn't quite that easy, collected all of the quest materials. Agatha's mother brewed a medicine from them, and the girl recovered. But the next player who visited that house would find a sickly Agatha. As long as there were players to accept the quest, she was locked in an eternal cycle of painful disease and recovery. The campaign quest Austin and I had started was an expanded version of that concept. After a 20-minute battle, we defeated the Forest Elf Knight and saved Kismel's life. But as more players took on the quest after us, dozens, if not hundreds, of Kismels would die, along with a similar number of handsome forest elves. But that was unavoidable. If each quest was only playable by one player or party for the sake of story consistency, the game would lose all pretense of fairness. It might be one thing to sidestep the creating an infinite number of unique quests, but that's not realistically possible. Even the mad genius like Akihito Kayaba. When I finished explaining all this to Asuna, she nodded, slowly, and thanked me for the information. But I suspected she'd known all along. Like her, there was something about this that sat wrong with me. After all, an event-related NPC, Kismel was all too human. Or elvish. A lonely, plaintive horn blew within the camp. I checked my clock and saw that it was already 6 o'clock. Plagued by equal parts of sleepiness and hunger, I was wondering which of the two addresses when the flap of the tent of entrance lifted open. It was Kismel, the owner of the tent. She was still dressed in her gleaming metal armor and long cape. Austin and I hastily scrambled to our feet. Kismel looked at us in turn and said, "I'm afraid I cannot offer you much at this humble camp, but you are free to use this tent however much you wish. The dining tent will serve you food anytime you need it. There's also a simple tent for bathing." "You have a bath?" Asuna repeated instantly. Kismel nodded and pointed off to her left. "It is next to the dining tent. Again, it is available at your leisure." "Thank you. I'm certainly going to take advantage of that," Asuna said without hesitation. bowing to Kismil and heading out of the tent flap without a backward glance at me. Kismil strode farther inside and said, "I believe I will have a rest. Just say the word if you need anything." I was still idly contemplating whether I should prioritize food or sleep when Kismil stopped next to the heater, put her hand on the large gemstone that acted as a clasp on her shoulder plate. With a strange tinkling sound, her armor, cape, and saber vanished into motes of light. All that was left beneath it was the sheer undergarments that shone like silk. I was so shocked that I couldn't pull my gaze away. There was a distinctly un-elven volume to her body beneath the black fabric. Perhaps that was made of her dark elf? Suddenly, a hand grabbed the back of my collar, and an icy voice said into my ear, "You should take a bath as well. You must have gotten sweaty after the first boss fight." Well, I'm certainly feeling a cold sweat now. An irresistible force dragged me back outward through the entrance of the tent. Outside, the dark elf camp looked even more fantastical than usual, with the transition from late afternoon to evening. Here and there, about the base, were elegantly designed steel mesh cages holding silent, purplish flames. A restrained lute melody was playing from one of the tents, to which the crickets in the grass added their own ringing harmony. Even the soldiers' laughs, coming from the large dining tent and the clanging hammer of the elves' attendant blacksmith, seemed like a musical instrument, adding to the performance. I walked behind Asana, concentrating on the unfamiliar sounds of the non-human camp. Suddenly, I remembered a very important mission, called out to the back of the tunic ahead. "Oh, Asana." "What?" She slowed down, and I could catch up to her, but I did not stop walking. "The NPC blacksmith here is really high level, so we should upgrade your weapon to maximum while we can." "To maximum? Are you sure?" She replied doubtfully. She must have been recalling the scene of her favorite sword helplessly shattered before her eyes several days ago. Of course, that was only a fake substitute, switch in for the quick change mod. She hadn't known at any other time. The visceral shock still remained in her memory. I nodded vigorously to set her at ease. "You might not have a 100% chance of success, but the few materials should boost the rate to maximum. If we can get yours to +6, that should allow you to go through the middle of this floor." Asana bought her beloved Wind Fleuret just before the strategy meeting for the first floor boss raid. Statistically, it wasn't really cut out for the third floor, but if upgraded completely, everyone's limited upgrade attempts successful, it might serve her a little while longer. For me, it was a rare prioritization of sentiment over efficiency. But to my surprise, Asana looked down, mulled it over. Her fingers wandered along her waist as though searching for her sheath of the rapier that was currently stored away in her inventory. "Remember what you said before? About melting down a sword to use material for a new one?" Yeah, that's right. Could I have done it here with their blacksmith?" "Sure, if you want," but Asana finally stopped walking and turned to me, causing me to realize I'd stopped already. There was a rare hint of a smile on her face. "Thanks for the concern, but if we're going to brave the risk of attempting an upgrade for a sword, I'm just going to get rid of it in a few days. I'd rather have it reborn here." I see. If that was how Asana felt, it wasn't my place to tell her otherwise. "All right. I'm sure it'll make for a powerful blade." Well, let's go see the blacksmith's tent. I headed for the other direction, and Asana grabbed my shirt. "The bath comes first." I didn't remember if the base camp had a bath during the beta, but even if it did, none of our male party would have bothered to use it. If we wanted to bathe back then, we could just log out and take a real one. If any of us fell asleep in the tents, it was to enjoy the camping experience, nothing more. Even now that we were permanently trapped in here, I wasn't particularly attached to the idea of bathing, but it was clearly a top priority for my temporary partner. Perhaps, if there was a magical hot spring that offered its own buff effect, but in that case, I'd jump in fully clothed. The sensation of being wet was unpleasant, added a bit of weight, but it wore off soon after you left the water. Since this bath was a favorite of dark elves, perhaps it did have some magical effect of its own. Then again, it might have a negative prank effect, like causing your ears to grow pointier, and the longer you stayed in the water. Austin and I arrived at a small tent behind the dining area, while I pointlessly pondered the effect of elf baths. We stopped and looked at each other. There was only one entrance to the bathing tent, so there was no making a swinging flap that was designed for male or female. Asuna silently parted the flaps to peer inside, then pulled her head out. There's only one bath in there. I see. Even as a dweeby middle schooler, I knew enough not to joke that this meant we had to bathe together. I put on a serious face as I could manage and stepped back. In that case, I'll go next door and grab a bite while you're bathing. Take your time. I'll come back when you're... I asked this before. But are you sure this place is outside the crime prevention zone? I blinked a few times, baffled by this seemingly unrelated question, then nodded. That's right. Which means it would be dangerous to remove all of our equipment here. Well, in the general sense, sure. In that case, it makes sense for one of us to stand guard at the entrance while the other is bathing. We can flip a coin to see who goes first. I finally understood Asuna's concern. She wasn't truly afraid of a sudden attack by monsters or enemy players, but the possibility of a male dark elves in the camp barging in while she was bathing. It seemed silly to get it worked up about NPCs, but I could see her point. Given that it was my fault that Argo, the information dealer, had burst into the bathroom while Asuna was bathing earlier, I ought to be accommodating her here. I reached that conclusion in the span of a second and nodded to reassure her. Understood. I'll take the second turn. You go first. Thank you. Asuna grinned and disappeared into the tent with blinding speed. It was a brief moment. The flap was raised. I saw an elegantly carved bathtub filled to the lip with a pale green water. The only thing separating the bathing area from the outside would be a simple cloth door that hung loose in the wind. It was easy to see why a girl would feel uncertain about bathing on her own in such circumstances. If it was that bad, she probably didn't need to take a virtual bath, I thought, but she had her own priorities. In a world where death lurked around every corner, there had to be some way to relax, let away accumulate stress away. I needed to find my own way to refresh, while we were both here in the safety of the camp. I sat down, leaned back against a support pillar. From beyond a simple layer of canvas, I heard two small swishing sounds. Those had to be the commands to remove all clothes and then all underwear. There was a splash, then a contented sigh. How can anyone relax like this? I growled at myself, folded my arms, and assumed a Zen sitting position. SAO had a meditation skill, but not a specific Zen skill. I prided myself on my ability to focus my concentration. However, I might not be able to fully relax here, but I could at least dedicate my mind to future build choices and equipment upgrade paths. Came a faint melody humming to my ears, obliterated my concentration. At this point, it seemed like the only possible solution to this quandary was if the pillar had failed to support my weight, sending me tumbling backwards into the tent. But the thick log stayed firm, lodged concretely into the ground. The metal assault of splashing and humming continued, unbated, for the next 30 minutes.